Sunday morning, 2024. A church in suburban Phoenix advertises itself simply as Grace Community Church. No denomination listed. No theological tradition identified. Just community and Jesus. Inside, 800 people worship. Contemporary music. Practical preaching. Coffee bar. Excellent kids programs. It looks like thousands of other churches across America. This investigation is based on documented research, denominational statistics, and sociological analysis. Ask the pastor what denomination they're part of. We're non-denominational, he says with pride. We're not about labels or tradition. We're just about Jesus. Ask the congregation. Most don't know, or care, what denomination means. Several grew up Baptist, Methodist, or Presbyterian. They left those churches specifically because they wanted no-label faith. This scene is playing out across America. According to research tracking religious affiliation, approximately 40 million Americans now attend non-denominational churches, making non-denominational the second largest group in American Protestantism after Southern Baptists. In 1970, non-denominational churches barely registered in surveys. By 2024, they represent nearly 1 in 4 Protestant churchgoers. The denominational exodus is one of the most significant shifts in American religious history, and most Christians haven't noticed it's happening. Sarah left her Presbyterian church in 2018 for a non-denominational congregation. She told me, "I got tired of denominational politics, historical baggage, and tradition for tradition's sake. I wanted authentic faith, not institutional religion. Going non-denominational felt like freedom." What's driving the exodus? Why are millions abandoning denominations their grandparents died in? What's gained, and what's lost? When Christians choose no-label faith, today we're investigating the denominational exodus. Why 40 million Americans rejected denominational identity. What non-denominational churches offer that denominations can't. What this massive shift reveals about contemporary American Christianity, and whether no-label faith is sustainable or just another form of religious consumerism that will produce its own crisis. Because the denominational exodus isn't just reshaping American Christianity. It's revealing what American Christians actually value and what they're willing to abandon. The rise of non-denominational Christianity represents one of the most dramatic shifts in American religious history. For centuries, American Protestantism was defined by denominations: Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Pentecostals. Denominational identity shaped theology, worship, polity, and practice. Churches proudly displayed denominational names on their signs. Christians identified by denomination when asked about their faith. But starting in the 1970s, 80s, and accelerating dramatically in the 2000s to 2010s, according to surveys tracking religious affiliation, millions of Americans began abandoning denominational identity. Some left denominational churches entirely for non-denominational congregations. Others remained in denominational churches but stopped identifying denominationally, calling themselves just Christian rather than Methodist or Baptist. The result, according to recent data, is that approximately 40 million Americans now attend non-denominational churches, with millions more in denominational churches who reject denominational identity. The reasons for the exodus, according to research interviewing those who left denominations, are complex. Frustration with denominational politics and bureaucracy, desire for contemporary worship and relevant teaching unencumbered by tradition, rejection of theological labels and historical baggage, attraction to churches focused on Jesus, not religion, and fundamentally, according to analysts, a shift toward consumerist approach to faith where Christians choose churches like they choose restaurants, based on personal preference rather than theological conviction or tradition. Today, we're investigating the denominational exodus, why it happened, what non-denominational churches offer that made millions leave traditions they grew up in, what's lost when theological identity becomes optional, and what the exodus reveals about contemporary American Christianity's strengths and weaknesses. Because understanding why 40 million chose no-label faith means understanding what American Christians value, and what they've decided doesn't matter anymore. To understand the denominational exodus, you need to know how American Christianity became denominational, and what changed to make denominations seem unnecessary or even harmful. American Protestantism was born denominational, according to historians of American religion. Settlers brought their European traditions, Anglican, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Reformed. The First Great Awakening, 1730s-40s, added Methodists and Baptists. The Second Great Awakening, 1790s to 1840s, spawned new denominations like Disciples of Christ and Churches of Christ. By 1900, American Protestantism was a patchwork of denominations, each with distinct theology, polity, and practice. Denominations served important functions. They provided theological identity and accountability. They resourced local churches through publishing houses, seminaries, and mission boards. They maintained standards for clergy and doctrine. They connected local churches to broader movements and traditions. And they represented different theological convictions. Baptists emphasized believers' baptism and congregational governance. Presbyterians emphasized Reformed theology and elder governance. Methodists emphasized sanctification and episcopal structure. But by the mid-20th century, according to sociological analysis, denominations began declining in cultural authority and member loyalty. Several factors contributed. The ecumenical movement, 1950s, 60s, emphasized Christian unity over denominational distinctives, making denominational boundaries seem petty. The Jesus movement, 1970s, emphasized personal relationship with Jesus over institutional religion, making denominations seem bureaucratic and lifeless. Here's the shift most people missed. Christianity went from being about what you believed to being about who you knew, and denominations represented beliefs, not relationships. The megachurch movement, 1980s to 2000s, demonstrated that churches could succeed spectacularly without denominational affiliation. Willow Creek, Saddleback, and others grew massive congregations as independent churches, proving denominational connection wasn't necessary for success. Bill Hybels and Rick Warren became more influential than any denominational leaders. Their books, conferences, and methods shaped thousands of churches, regardless of denomination. The seeker-sensitive philosophy explicitly minimized denominational identity as a barrier to reaching unchurched people. The rise of Christian media and parachurch organizations, 1980s to 2000s, shifted authority from denominations to independent ministries and personalities. Christians listened to radio preachers, watched televangelists, attended Promise Keepers rallies, and read books by authors from various traditions. Their theological formation came from media and conferences rather than denominational teaching. This created evangelical identity that transcended denominations. People felt more connected to broader evangelicalism than to their specific tradition. By 2000, according to research tracking church trends, conditions were ripe for mass exodus from denominations. Younger generations had minimal loyalty to institutions their parents valued. Consumer culture taught Americans to choose based on personal preference rather than inherited tradition. And importantly, denominational scandals, political divisions, and theological battles made denominations seem like problems rather than solutions. The stage was set for millions to leave, and that's exactly what happened. By 2024, according to denominational statistics and religious surveys, the exodus from denominations has fundamentally reshaped American Protestantism. The numbers tell a dramatic story of institutional decline and non-denominational growth. Mainline denominations have collapsed. United Methodist Church declined from 11 million members, 1970, to approximately 5.4 million, 2024. Presbyterian Church, USA, dropped from 4 million to 1.2 million. Episcopal Church fell from 3.4 million to under 1.6 million. ELCA lost 34% of members since formation in 1988. These aren't just normal decline, they're institutional crises threatening denominational survival. Even evangelical denominations, once growing, now stagnate or shrink. Southern Baptist Convention peaked around 16 million members in 2006. By 2024, they reported approximately 13 million, nearly 3 million members lost. Assemblies of God, once explosively growing, has plateaued. Other evangelical denominations show similar patterns: flat or declining membership, aging congregations, financial stress. Meanwhile, non-denominational churches have exploded in numbers and attendance. According to Hartford Institute research, non-denominational churches represent the fastest-growing segment of American Protestantism. In 1990, approximately 200,000 Americans attended non-denominational megachurches. By 2024, that number exceeds 8 million. Total non-denominational church attendance, according to surveys, is approximately 40 million, roughly 25% of Protestant churchgoers. If denominations were supposed to preserve Christian faith and unity, why are millions fleeing them for churches with no historical connection or accountability? The demographics of the exodus reveal who's leaving and why. Younger generations lead the departure. According to surveys, Millennials and Gen Z are far less likely to identify denominationally than Boomers or Gen X. They're comfortable with just Christian identity and see denominational labels as divisive or irrelevant. Geographic patterns show the exodus is strongest in suburban and urban areas where multiple church options exist, allowing consumer choice. Rural areas with fewer alternatives maintain stronger denominational loyalty, but often out of necessity rather than conviction. The reasons people give for leaving denominations, according to research interviewing those who left, cluster around several themes: denominational politics and bureaucracy, perception that denominations are more concerned with institutional survival than mission; theological liberalism in mainline denominations, conservatives leaving over sexuality issues, biblical authority questions, and perceived drift from orthodoxy; theological rigidity in conservative denominations, moderates and progressives leaving over culture war politics and lack of openness; desire for contemporary worship and relevant teaching, perception that denominational churches are stuck in outdated traditions; attraction to large, well-resourced churches, megachurches, often non-denominational, offer programs and experiences smaller denominational churches can't match. The denominational response has been largely ineffective, according to analysis of strategies denominations have tried. Some denominations have rebranded, changing names or de-emphasizing denominational identity in marketing. Others have adopted contemporary worship and church growth methods, essentially copying what non-denominational churches do while maintaining denominational structure. Still others have doubled down on denominational identity, emphasizing tradition and heritage. None of these strategies have reversed the exodus. Denominations continue bleeding members while non-denominational churches absorb former denominational Christians. So what exactly do non-denominational churches offer that makes 40 million Americans choose them over denominations? To understand non-denominational appeal, researchers analyzing church growth and religious switching point to several factors that resonate with contemporary American culture. Freedom from institutional baggage allows churches to focus on mission without defending historical positions or navigating denominational politics. According to interviews with non-denominational pastors, they appreciate not having to explain or defend denominational decisions they weren't involved in. When a denomination experiences scandal or controversy, non-denominational churches remain unaffected. Contemporary relevance without traditional constraints means worship, preaching, and ministry methods can change quickly to adapt to culture. Non-denominational churches, according to analysis of their practices, adopt trends faster than denominational churches bound by tradition or polity. If worship styles change, programs shift, or teaching emphasis evolves, non-denominational churches can pivot immediately. At this point, the pattern becomes clear. Non-denominational churches offer faith designed around preference rather than conviction. Local autonomy and decision-making appeal to Americans suspicious of institutional authority. Non-denominational churches are self-governing, accountable only to their own leadership and members. No external denominational body can impose requirements, remove pastors, or dictate positions. This appeals to Americans valuing freedom and local control, though critics argue it removes necessary accountability. Focus on Jesus, not religion, resonates with Americans skeptical of institutional Christianity. Non-denominational churches emphasize relationship over religion, community over institution, and Bible over tradition. This frames denominations as religion, negative, while non-denominational churches represent authentic, Jesus, positive. A dichotomy that's theologically questionable but culturally powerful. But here's what researchers discovered. What looks like freedom from tradition is often just freedom from accountability, and that creates its own problems. The dark side of non-denominational Christianity reveals itself in concerning patterns. Lack of accountability for theology and practice means non-denominational pastors can teach anything without external checks. Heresy, abuse, and financial impropriety are harder to address without denominational structures to investigate and discipline. Celebrity pastor culture flourishes in non-denominational contexts where charismatic leaders operate with minimal oversight. Theological incoherence affects many non-denominational churches where teaching depends entirely on current pastors' preferences. According to analysis of non-denominational church theology, it's often eclectic and unstable, borrowing from various traditions without systematic coherence. When pastors change, theology can shift dramatically because there's no denominational anchor. Historical amnesia disconnects non-denominational Christians from 2,000 years of church history and wisdom. Many non-denominational Christians know nothing of church councils, Reformation debates, or theological development. They essentially reinvent Christianity each generation without learning from the past. And critically, non-denominational churches, despite claiming independence, are actually highly networked through conference culture, publishing, and informal associations, creating invisible denominations without formal accountability. Sarah grew up in a Presbyterian church in North Carolina. She told me she left in 2018 for a non-denominational congregation because denominations felt irrelevant. I got tired of pussa politics, debates about sexuality, Israel divestment, denominational restructuring. None of it connected to my daily faith. I wanted a church focused on Jesus and community, not institutional drama. Sarah described her non-denominational church as refreshing. No baggage, no defending positions I didn't hold, just worship, teaching, and serving. It felt like what church should be, simple and authentic. For the first time, church wasn't something she inherited. It was something she curated. When asked what she lost by leaving, Sarah paused. I guess historical connection, theological depth, but honestly, I don't miss it. The Presbyterian distinctives we learned felt like academic exercises, not living faith. Sarah represents millions of younger Christians who see denominations as institutional burdens rather than spiritual resources, and feel no loss in abandoning them. David pastors a United Methodist church in Ohio. He told me he's watched his congregation shrink as members leave for non-denominational churches. We've lost probably 200 people in the last decade to the big non-denominational church across town. They offer better music, bigger kids programs, more exciting preaching. We can't compete with their resources. David described the frustration. People tell me they're leaving because of denominational conflict over sexuality or politics. But then they join churches that are just as conservative or progressive. They just aren't labeled denominational. David believes the Exodus reveals deeper issues. People want church that serves their preferences. Denominations require accepting things you might not like because you're part of a broader tradition. Non-denominational churches let you avoid that. David worries about what's lost: historical wisdom, theological accountability, connection to the global church. Non-denominational Christianity is radically individualistic, and I'm not sure that's sustainable long-term. Michael leads a non-denominational church in Texas that grew from 150 to 1,200 in 8 years. He told me non-denominational identity is key to their success. We don't carry baggage from denominational decisions we didn't make. We're not United Methodist fighting over sexuality or Southern Baptist navigating women in ministry debates. We're just followers of Jesus serving our community. Michael described the freedom as liberating. I can preach what I believe Scripture teaches without checking if it aligns with denominational positions. Our elders make decisions for our church without external approval. We keep money locally for mission rather than funding bureaucracy. When asked about accountability concerns, Michael disagreed. We're accountable to our elders, our congregation, and God. We don't need a denomination for that. Actually, denominations often protect bad pastors because of institutional loyalty. Michael believes non-denominational is Christianity's future. Young people aren't interested in denominations. They want authentic community and practical faith. That's what we offer, and why we're growing while denominations decline. Rachel attended 5 different churches in 3 years, all non-denominational. She told me the freedom eventually felt empty. At first, I loved having options. If I didn't like the worship or preaching, I'd try another church. Non-denominational meant I could find exactly what I wanted. Rachel described growing dissatisfaction. But church became like shopping. Nothing was permanent. When things got hard or I disagreed with leadership, I'd just leave. I never had to work through conflict or stay committed when it wasn't comfortable. Rachel eventually joined a Presbyterian church, denominational. I needed structure and accountability. At my PCA church, I can't just leave when I'm annoyed. There's process, covenant, and connection to something bigger than my preferences. Rachel's experience reveals the limits of consumer Christianity. Eventually, some crave the very constraints denominations provide. The moment the denominational exodus became irreversible, according to sociologists tracking religious change, was the 2000s to 2010s when social media and online content accelerated the shift from institutional to individual religious authority. Before the internet age, Christians depended on local churches and denominational resources for theological formation. Sunday school curriculum, denominational magazines, and seminary-trained pastors transmitted tradition across generations. But as Christians gained unlimited access to sermons, worship, teaching, and theological content from any source via YouTube, podcasts, and social media, denominational gatekeeping collapsed. A Baptist could be discipled by a non-denominational megachurch pastor's podcast. A Methodist could learn theology from Reformed bloggers. Denominational identity became one option among infinite choices rather than the primary shaper of faith. This technological shift coincided with cultural individualism, where Americans increasingly prioritized personal choice and customization in every area of life. Just as they curated music playlists, Netflix queues, and social media feeds, they began curating faith, choosing teachings, worship styles, and theological positions a la carte rather than accepting denominational packages. The combination of technological access and cultural individualism made the denominational exodus not just possible but inevitable for millions who saw no reason to accept institutional authority when they could construct personalized faith. The denominational exodus, according to analysts studying American religion's trajectory, reveals patterns that will shape Christianity's future. First, institutional religion will continue declining while personalized, non-institutional faith grows. Denominations will shrink, merge, or close while non-denominational churches absorb former denominational Christians, a transfer of members rather than evangelistic growth. If the exodus is just Christians moving from denominational to non-denominational churches, is American Christianity actually growing or just rearranging? Second, theological coherence and historical connection will further erode as more Christians lack grounding in specific traditions. Non-denominational Christianity, according to theological analysis, tends toward lowest common denominator theology that avoids controversial distinctives. This produces Christians who know generic evangelical talking points but lack theological depth or historical awareness. Third, accountability crises will increase as more churches operate without denominational oversight. Celebrity pastor scandals, theological heresy, and financial abuse are predictable outcomes when churches have no external accountability structures. Fourth, eventually non-denominational churches may recreate denominations under different names, informal networks of like-minded churches that function as denominations without formal structure. This is already happening through church planting networks, conference affiliations, and pastoral coalitions. Finally, a remnant of committed denominational Christians will remain, valuing tradition, accountability, and historical connection even as cultural majority chooses personalized faith. These remnants may become more distinctive and countercultural, offering alternative to the consumerism dominating American religion. The denominational exodus forces uncomfortable questions about what American Christians actually value, and whether no-label faith is freedom or just sophisticated consumerism. 40 million Americans chose non-denominational Christianity because denominations felt restrictive, irrelevant, or burdensome. They wanted faith without institutional baggage, worship without traditional constraints, and community without denominational politics. And non-denominational churches offered exactly that: Christianity designed around preference rather than conviction. But what's lost when 40 million choose no-label faith? Historical connection to 2,000 years of Christian wisdom and tradition. Theological accountability that prevents error and abuse. Systematic theology that provides coherent framework for understanding Scripture and doctrine. Global connection to Christians across time and space who share tradition and heritage. And perhaps most critically, the discipline of staying committed to community and tradition even when it's uncomfortable, even when you disagree, even when leaving would be easier. The denominational exodus reveals a hard truth. American Christianity increasingly values personal preference over communal commitment, and that's producing faith that's shallow, unstable, and ultimately unsustainable. Denominations, for all their flaws, preserved important things. They maintained theological standards across generations. They provided accountability for leaders and churches. They connected local congregations to global movements and historical traditions. They required Christians to submit to something bigger than their personal preferences, to stay even when they disagreed, work through conflict rather than leave, and value unity over comfort. Non-denominational Christianity abandons much of this, not maliciously but inevitably when there's no institutional structure requiring it. The path forward isn't simply returning to denominations as they were. Many of the criticisms that drove the exodus are valid. Denominations did become bureaucratic, politically divided, and disconnected from mission. They did fight over secondary issues while losing their evangelistic urgency. They did make it hard for younger generations to understand why denominational identity mattered. But the solution isn't abandoning institutions entirely for personalized consumer faith. The solution is reformation, denominations that maintain theological conviction and historical connection while eliminating bureaucratic bloat, that provide accountability without stifling innovation, that require commitment without demanding conformity on secondary issues. Whether such reformation is possible remains uncertain. Current trends suggest continued exodus, denominations shrinking while non-denominational churches grow. But the weaknesses of consumer Christianity will eventually become apparent. The scandals without accountability, the theological drift without anchors, the instability when charismatic leaders fall or leave, the shallowness that can't sustain faith through suffering. And when those weaknesses emerge, some will rediscover that what felt like restrictive tradition was actually protective wisdom. That accountability wasn't bureaucracy but necessity. That denomination wasn't label but identity rooted in something deeper than personal preference. Churches don't need labels to be faithful, but they do need tradition, accountability, and connection to something bigger than themselves. The denominational exodus traded all of that for consumer freedom, and we're about to discover what that freedom costs. 40 million Americans chose no-label faith. The question is whether what they built can last, or whether they've created another form of American Christianity that prioritizes preference over faithfulness, comfort over commitment, and personal choice over communal accountability. The answer will determine not just the future of denominations, but the future of American Christianity itself. Because a faith built entirely on individual preference cannot sustain community long-term. And a Christianity without historical roots, theological accountability, or institutional commitment is just spiritualized consumerism, which will eventually collapse under the weight of its own shallowness.